Hello, one and all, and welcome back to another episode of the Omnia Performance Podcast with myself and two silent men. Cheers, guys. You were meant to introduce yourself there.
I mean,
Usually,
I assumed
Johnny,
Johnny.
that was on you.
I assumed you were going to say who myself was. Usually it's myself, Fergus Crawley, and then that leads in really nicely to yeah. So I was waiting. I thought I genuinely had one of those kind of movie moments where I thought, oh shit, they've frozen. So yes,
I do normally say my name, don't I?
It's okay. It's okay. Let's run it as it is. And myself, Johnny Payne.
And Simon Jeffries, who we will introduce more after this cataclysmic mess is over. Anyway, speaking of cataclysmic messes, it would be a big old mess if you haven't yet hit follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on and shared this episode or an episode previously with a friend. Do check us out on YouTube and sign up to the mailing list in the show notes down below. And please check out previous episodes as well, as there is lots of insights, lots of waffle, lots of humour, and lots of messy intros like this one to listen to.
Cataclysmic intros. Yeah. That's one
So
of
with
about
that in
8, I'm
mind,
sure.
that's generous. With that in mind, I think it's wise to introduce today's guest without such a long pause, and that is Mr. Simon Jeffries. If you could describe yourself in a couple of sentences, Simon, you've got an elevator or lift trip, as we say on this side of the world, up three floors, and you've got to describe yourself to the eager corporate stooge that's standing next to you. Go.
Former special forces who now coaches people to true confidence using that real world experience that I got in special forces combined with the latest psychology and neuroscience around behaviour change to make it as easy as possible for someone to get to not only where they want to be but who they want to be. So feeling happy and content in life, feeling confident in yourself and having that clear purpose to move forwards.
Ding.
That's what I do.
There we go. Elevators out. Well done. You've clearly been in a lot of lifts recently.
That's a lot of lift experience.
Good. So today we're really going to focus on your time in the special forces and the military, and I think the question that I'm always most drawn to, I don't know about you, Johnny, but it's the one that is really at the crux of a specific decision, which is what drew you to the military in the first place, and then beyond that, what drew you to taking it one step further and going for the creme de la creme of the military, the special forces. So it's probably just worth starting with the person you were, the child you were, the childhood you had that led you to the decision of deciding that the military was for you.
I was very lucky, I think, in this, and this is a question that I've reflected on. I still don't have the perfect answer. So I grew up on a small farm in Worcestershire. It's a small dairy farm. And I loved the outdoors from an early age. So I was always just out in the woods building dens, cubs, scouts, fishing, hunting. Just loved the outdoors, loved adventure. Adventure always appealed to me. Those were the kind of books that I'd read or TV and films I'd watch. And from a very early age, the military was definitely something that I was drawn to. And I would say, in fact, I don't even have to say it's a fact because I have a photo, although I still can't dig it out. From the age of 11, I had a very firm conviction that was the path that I was going to take. And there's a picture somewhere on our first day of high school. Our form tutor got everyone to write down, your name. I'm Simon Jeffries, and when I leave school, I want to be. And mine is, I want to be a Royal Marines Commando. So even as specific as that.
11
and that's the
old,
thing.
Did you say?
Yeah, 11. So first day of high school. So I can see where the idea for the military formed, because I think the idea of adventure, the whole ethos around the military appealed to me. I have no doubt that the films I watched as a kid, sneaking down to watch, it was all the 80s action films. And I kind of make a joke of this, watching Commando, Predator, all those type of films. But I think it probably did have an impact because, we assign role models, etc. And I was always drawn to people who push themselves, I guess, to strength, confidence, in combination with that outdoor element and the adventure element. where the specificity came from the Royal Marines, I cannot tell you. I must have just seen an advert or something and something about it, and I don't think they were doing that advertising campaign that early, but the whole 99.9% need not apply. So interestingly, with that campaign, it was actually a massive disaster because 99% didn't apply, so it didn't actually have the effect. However, for those that it did speak to, and it definitely spoke to me, it was incredibly powerful. So I guess it's a bit like Marmite, either put you off or it really draws you forward. And for me, that was a massive appeal, something that's a huge challenge, something that you have to work really hard at to attain. And that definitely tapped into who I was. And I think I also had strong role models. I was very lucky that the rugby club that I played at, Ian Narroway, whose son actually went on to captain Gloucester, and Luke Narroway, and played for England on a couple of occasions. We had such a strong team as a unit, like so strong, and he was such a good coach. I remember being in some of those team huddles, and you can still get goosebumps now. Like we were so close and worked so hard, and that bond and working as a team in something physical to achieve a goal, i.e. winning the game, that's how I thought the military would be as a career. And it was. That's exactly what it was. And so I think all of these things combined to just give me a very clear purpose. And I was very lucky in that sense, because I know a lot of people find it hard in life to work out what it is that they want to do. And I did experience that when I left the military. I did experience that. But when I was younger, I had that very clear path that this is what I want to do and this is who I want to be.
Presumably as well, you mentioned scouting, Cubs and Scouts and things as well. Were you part of that organisation or just on the periphery? Is that something you were involved in?
Yeah, no, part of it. So I did Cubs, did Scouts, did Cadets. Okay. So kind of all those organisations, again, which tap into that, Scouts, Cubs and Scouts formed by Baden-Powell, who took part in the Boer War. So it still has that kind of
heavy military connection there, isn't there?
Yeah, military connection in the background, and kind of runs through. It's all about self-sufficiency, outdoor, adventure in the outdoors, learning new skills, a massive emphasis on learning new skills within it. So again, it's all these attributes that the military that is attached to the military. I guess all the idea of the military when people look at it. Yeah,
there's also I've got a long experience with scouting. My dad was a chief commissioner for the north of Scotland, and we grew up in amongst scouting. And there's something that I guess I didn't discover this until I looked back on it, but it speaks very much to where your mind was at the time. Is that there's a very disciplined nature to it as well, and you know your place within your patrol, I suppose, in scouting, and I guess you'd have had some. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd expect you'd have had a certain amount of experience going into the military of understanding, a certain amount of regimented behaviour in the sense that you knew where you sat in the pack, you knew what your duties were. Very much a scenario or a situation where you the idea of duty is instilled in you. We had you'll remember yourself. You stand up and declare your duty or your sense of duty to the patrol, to the Scouts, and to God and the Queen, and all that kind of stuff. And but overall, there's a kind of a structure there that kind of lends itself, presumably, to what you went on to experience afterwards. And presumably, you must have enjoyed that as well.
Yeah, I think that's the key point in that question. Is if you don't enjoy structure, then you're probably not going to enjoy things like Cubs or Scouts or the military, and it's not going to appeal to you. If you're someone that kind of rallies against that or fights it, then it's not going to have that appeal. Whereas structure and discipline, I bet, and it's chicken and egg. Did I embrace that because the idea of the military appealed, or did I have a natural inclination to embrace that structure and discipline? Ironically, I spent most of my career within the Special Forces group, where you're actually quite free of that. And once I joined the military, and especially being in that environment, I don't know how much time I could have spent in, especially the Army, say, in comparison to the Marines, because it is much more regimented and structured and disciplined. And actually having freedom, the freedom that we had in Special Forces did appeal to me much more, but we can come on to that in a bit.
So with that in mind, what drew you to the Marines in terms of the actual process? So at what age did you begin the application? What were the challenges along the way? And how did you actually get on with application, arrival, testing, all the things that go with joining the Corps?
The Marines, so for me, it was always going to be the Royal Marines, perhaps maybe the Parachute Regiment, because from the outside, the way that they are marketed is these are the hardest ones to get into for infantry soldiering. And so straight away, that was an appeal. It's like, okay, this is the hardest. This is, the creme de la creme, however you want to phrase it. Well, that's how they're, put out there. So that really appealed to me. I was always going to, my intention was always to join as an officer. That was my goal, to go to university and then join as an officer. So I finished school, did college, did a year of travelling, did university, did another year of travelling, and then went to join. And I think within that, because some people ask, well, why didn't, if it was that much of an obsession, why didn't you join earlier? And even when I was in university, I didn't do OC, is it officer training card, OTC or whatever it's called. I basically didn't do anything within any kind of military connotations, because I think for me, I knew that I was going to do it, and that was a certainty in my mind, and it allowed a degree of freedom of, well, I'm just going to go and experience these other bits while I'm young, and then I'll do it. So it almost gave me more freedom having that clear purpose. So I was going to do the officer route, start the application when I came back from New Zealand, and the very first thing that you do is go to a careers office and do a psychometric test, essentially. And then after that, you would go and do some days at Lympstone. You go to an Admiralty interview board where you have to answer questions and a few other bits like that. None of that ever happened because I failed the psychometric test. Maths has always been my nemesis. Never enjoyed maths, never been very good at it. And I failed the maths portion of that psychometric test. And so I came back so basically you do the test, you go away, you walk around for a couple of hours, and you come back and they give you the results. So I came back and basically got told I'd failed. And so I had the option of either waiting another 6 months to retake that test, or I could just apply and join as rank and file, essentially. Just join straight away. And I remember I didn't even really think about it for probably even more than 15 minutes. For me, it was, okay, failed at that first hurdle. However, what's the end state? I still want to join. Do I want to wait around another 6 months? No, fine, I'll just join. And I don't, when I look back, I can't even remember having that much conflict about it, which is interesting because I'd always set my sights on, okay, I'm going to join as an officer, and been saying that for years. And yet I was able to pivot quite quickly. And I think it was because the overriding drive for me was just to join. And so to me, that was just a slight diversion as opposed to everything ending. And I guess that belief that, well, I'll just make it work via this route. It's going to get me to the same end point of where I want to be, i.e. serving the Royal Marines. So fine, I'll just go that path. And looking back, it was actually great, because once I joined, and obviously I'm sure officers have great careers as well, but what I found while being in is that there are a lot more options for different roles and jobs as a rank and file as opposed to an officer. There is a narrower spectrum of what you can do. So in retrospect, it was a good thing, and I had a brilliant career going down the path that I did, but you can only see that backwards.
One thing that strikes me as you're talking, Simon, is I don't know if it's fair to say you haven't mentioned yourself that you have a competitive nature, or what it might be that at such an early age has you, the failure at the maths aside, but has you kind of pointed quite so early towards excellence, because you've said a moment ago that the Paras and the Royal Marines stood out as being those kind of elite units now, and not to decry any other units, but I think anybody looking in can understand why you would think that at the time. But that's obviously, you've sat and thought, right, if I'm going to go in, I'm going to go in and I'm going to be involved in these elite units. Was there something that drove you towards that particular kind of, you're shooting for the top, whether it's officer or not, you still want to be part of this group, as opposed to just in the military. And again, I don't want that to sound negative in any sense, but it sounds to me like something's driving you.
No, absolutely. I think that's something I've not really touched upon before. That competitive side was a huge draw for me. So and again, nature nurture, how much of this is innate, how much of it is developed. There's probably definitely a part of my personality that has that. From my parents, the ethos of working hard 100% was instilled. It was always about try your best, but do your best, as long as you've tried your hardest, then that's all anyone can ask, but you should put 100% effort into whatever you do. And I think seeing how much they grafted on a daily basis, the small farm, there's not much money in it, especially through kind of 90s and early 2000s. I think it's near impossible now to make a living purely on a small farm. So watching them graft, playing sport, I remember with rugby, talking about rugby training, I was never the best player. Like, my ball skills were okay. I played hooker. My throwing in was absolutely awful. But one thing that I always worked on was to be the fittest. It's like, I'm not the best player, but I will be the fittest player. I remember there was the forwards and the backs used to train separately for the fitness sessions. Traditionally, the backs are kind of fitter, slighter guys, lots more running. And there was me and one other guy that used to train with the backs and the fitness sessions, because we just always killed ourselves to be at that level. So, and even going back on the farm, during haymaking time, you would load up the bales onto the trailer, they'd get taken back to the barn and then unloaded. I used to try and unload a trailer on my own. I'd be like, right, I'm going to try this. I was like 12, 13, 14 years old. I'd be like, I'm going to do this myself, like throwing them up myself, stacking them in the barn, just to see if I could. And it was purely for that physical push, like, can I do this? I want to push myself and do it. And I think that was just embedded through, again, I guess, looking up to those role models, reading books about the military, watching those kind of films where you're seeing these like strong, fit guys, and that just appealed to me. That pushing yourself to see how much you can do and how far you can go has just always appealed.
It's interesting. So when it came you've kind of surrounded yourself with, like you say, these role models and a certain work ethic around you, that you've ended up fully immersed in the idea of what it is to be excellent, and part of that is to push yourself, which I guess those films speak to that somewhat as well, don't they?
That can only lead one direction as well when you're in the military, realistically, can't it, in terms of personality type? At the very least, giving it a go, whether you're successful or not, is the big question. But for you, that was the case. You were successful, and that is in the process of joining the Special Forces. So talk us through the decision-making that went into actually giving it a bash and what unfolded next.
I think it was always in the back of my mind, again, sort of rewinding slightly to childhood. I guess people have that thing, they want to be maybe a footballer when they grow up, or a rock star, or whatever it is. So for me, because I knew I wanted to join the military, my equivalent of a Premiership footballer or rock star was Special Forces. So at that time, it was books like Bravo 20 and Immediate Action from Andy McDabb. They were like getting Chris Ryan. And so I'd like read those books, and I just always had it in the back of my mind. I think that competitive nature. So once I'd made the switch from, okay, I'm not going the officer route, I'm going straight in, you then get given your PRMC, which is a Potential Royal Marines course. And before you go down, and from the careers office, you get like material basically on the Marines. And the Marines have a magazine called the Globe and Laurel. And every month in the Globe and Laurel, there is a picture of the King's Badgeman from the troop that has passed out. So the King's Badge is awarded to the best recruit in that training troop. And there's a picture in there with just his name. And from the moment I saw that in the magazine, I'm like, that's what I'm going to aim for. And I've only really looked at visualization in the last few years, now that we really coach it. And I don't know whether, I can't remember ever reading anything overtly about it, but I used visualization from that very early on, joining the military. It's like I saw myself in that position, and I did end up being the King's Badgeman for our troop 964.
Well done, mate.
So I guess
see, when you say, Simon, that you used visualization. Oh, sorry, I think we've gone across each other there just because of the connection. I'm interested in when you said you used visualization. Do you, at that age, did you use it the way that you would? Did you stumble across a method to use visualization, or were you, for want of a better way to put it, were you just sort of dreaming about this kind of picture that you'd seen and you in that magazine, or were you kind of manifesting that daily, kind of, this is who I am, this kind of internal mantra? How did you do that?
I cannot remember specifically learning a method of visualization, but looking back on it, I did use it in the way that we're very close to how we teach it now. I was creating a very clear picture of me in that magazine. Like, I am going to get to that point, and very much internalizing that, and internalizing with it, if I want to get to that point, then I essentially need to put the work in and be the best at every stage. Everything that I put my hand to is giving that full commitment and effort to become that person who can end up in the magazine. And I then used that, which we'll talk about in a minute, when I went on to apply for Special Forces. So, yeah, I can't think of an overtly seeing a method, but I did very much make it a daily practice, I guess, because I did have that obsession about joining. And so that was all I was thinking about anyway. And that was just a way to channel that or focus it into something specific.
Interesting, very interesting, mate. But please do, take us through the next stage as you're at this point where you've set your sights on Special Forces, and obviously you've done that earlier on. But there will have been a point in your military career where you'll have said, "Well, now is the time." Was there a trigger for that, or was it very much like the previous stuff where you've kind of timelined it and set your stall out very, very much in advance?
So I passed out of training. I went to 40 Commando. And I did just under a year there. And very quickly, I realised that I did... that I knew that was the route I wanted to go to Special Forces, but I didn't feel like I had enough experience at that time. Within the Marines, unlike the paras where you can essentially you join and you are just an infantry soldier the whole time, every specialisation within the Marines is done by a Marine. So everything from cooks, drivers, logistics, signallers, all of these different jobs. Whereas the paras will use an army regiment who provide the cooks, etc., to facilitate it. And that's where I think actually they do things better. They just remain as pure soldiers and you can stay dedicated to that. The Marines, you start off as what they call a general duties Marine, which essentially is just soldiering, but then you have to choose a specialisation. And if you don't choose something, you just get pinged. So it's like, right, you haven't put anything in, you're going to be a driver. And it's actually an important point on the military. I see a lot of people either love their careers or they just hate it. And one of the big differences I see is how much people manage their career. It's like drive forward with what you want. And so early on, I decided I wanted to go Special Forces, didn't feel like I had enough experience. So I went down the SFC route, which is Special Forces Communicator. Essentially, that's a 6-month selection course to work alongside Special Forces, whether that's the SAS or the SBS. So Marines tend to go down for SBS and the Army for SAS. And essentially you're a tactical signaller attached to them. So you go on operations, you do a lot of the same stuff, but you're not kicking down the doors. You're essentially there as a tactical signaller, so providing that comms between guys on the ground and back. So you're still like in the thick of it, I guess, but you're not leading the charge. You're there to provide that strategic communication. And I saw that as a good stepping stone because it meant I'd be based down with Special Forces down at Poole, so it's a permanent posting there. The pay was better, and I'm in that world. So it gives me a step into that world to give an insight into it, which in my mind was only going to help then to prepare for selection. So that was the first step that I took. And then it's from there after I'd done my 2 years return of service that I then put in as soon as I could for full selection.
How did that then unfold in terms of the process? Because we all hear a lot about the actual reality of selection, what sort of person you need to be going into it, how to train for it, how not to train for it, how you will develop over the hills, how to not cock up in the jungle, etc., etc. But your experience, I know we've spoken about this in the past, but your experience was one that was really underpinned by that drive from the age of 11, really, wasn't it? And that seemingly non-egotistical drive will have carried you forwards in a way that I'm sure it won't have done for those that were potentially more ego-driven, because the intrinsic desire that you had to be this person from such a young age, to me, seems much more purposeful than it does trying to prove something to somebody, which in a selection process I see as being make or break. So how did you actually interact with the process of selection, and how did that compare to other people's experiences around you?
I think the important point of what you're saying there, and the difference I think you see in success across any kind of endeavour, is how much you want to take on that challenge for the sake of doing it just for that challenge, as opposed to external rewards that you will get. So I was always driven towards Special Forces. I was driven towards the military because I loved the idea of it. I joined the military and I loved soldiering, and I wanted to pass selection to see if I was capable of serving as a soldier at that level, as opposed to I want to pass selection because I want to get paid more or get the best kit, or just to say that I can do it. Like I had an internal marker of, it's almost for myself. It's like I want to test myself and see if I am almost worthy of getting past it, and I don't need anyone else to see that, but I want to see if I can do. It's like when I was unloading those trailers of bales, no one was around to see that. I wanted to see if I could do it. So it was very much that internal metric that I wanted to meet. And talking back to that visualization again, I created a very strong picture around it, and I used like two simple things. At that time that I was working as a signaller down in Poole, everyone, all the guys that were badged to a pass selection were wearing a certain t-shirt, and it was like simple. It was a knock t-shirt by a company called Edgar Brothers, and it was just because they were giving them free with kit that they were ordering, and a watch that was being issued. It was the dive watch at the time, which I think was a Luminox one. So you could go and buy them. They weren't expensive, particularly expensive, especially not the t-shirt, but they just embodied, like, wearing that watch and wearing that t-shirt at that time. It's like embodied. It's like, this is what a Special Forces operator looks like, and I used that as a very visual cue of picturing myself in that t-shirt and wearing that watch, having passed.
You're back at the magazine again. Interesting.
Yeah. And I would just come back to it, and I'd use it all the time. Like every gym session I was doing, I was picturing myself having passed. I was linking the work. I think the important part here is I was linking the work that I was doing with the result that I wanted to get. So every time I was out, training on the hills, doing yomping, sessions in the gym, whatever it was, I was very clearly linking that to, this is who I want to become. This is the image. This is what I want to be able to step and wear that and like that's the reward, to be able to put on that t-shirt. So it wasn't even, I used that more than even like getting the beret or the badging ceremony. It was for whatever reason that spoke to me more, and that was, I guess, how I approached it. And I definitely saw on selection, you can see the difference between people who want to be there for the sake of being there and for the soldiering versus the image that it conveys. And you just can't, when things get really, really tough in any kind of challenge, whether that's the military, starting a business, sport, any of these things, when it gets really, really hard, if you have not got that deep internal drive to be there, no matter what the external rewards that come along with that are, it's just not going to be enough. You have to have that internal, something inside you that says, I am not leaving this. Like, the only way I'm coming off is if I'm either dead or medically withdrawn. Like, I am not going to take myself off this journey. I can suffer. I'm willing to suffer through. I think James Clear does it. It's not ask, instead of asking what do you want in terms of looking at goals, it's asking it, reverse that and ask, what am I willing to suffer through to get to that point? That's kind of the more pertinent question, I think.
In terms of the actual physical demand, Jonny and I, all three of us, in fact, know and have spoken to Gaz at great length over the years, and something he's always said that has stuck with me, that almost reframed my original perception of Special Forces applicants, is that they don't turn up anywhere near the finished article. They turn up as the foundations from which to be moulded into it. And I think you've just covered a really key bit of bedrock that goes beneath it from a psychological point of view in terms of what's driving a person forwards and why they're there in the first place. But the physical demands and the different way that people go about it, and the challenges and the pain and the suffering and the questions that go with it, everybody will have had different exposure to those things in the past which prepare them in different ways. Yours was obviously from a farm, but there might be people that come from an urban background that haven't had that sort of exposure, might not have had the exposures to the outdoors that you did, which will prepare them very differently. So when it actually came to hills, when it actually came to the jungle, what was the experience like? Did it surprise you? Did you feel well prepared? Did you at any point feel like you couldn't hack it and you had that inner voice, that inner demon on your shoulder going, oh, just pack it in. It's a bit humid, isn't it? You should probably just call it here, shouldn't you, mate? Which is actually quite relevant to what Jonny's about to go on. Because
I'm really listening hard now. We'll come back to that.
Because, what you're now two and a bit weeks out from 250k through the Peruvian Amazon. Yeah. And I was actually laughing in the gym yesterday with somebody about how out of all the 4 extreme ones you've got this year, I think the fact that you're going to be constantly, and I apologise everybody, moist for 5 days.
I'm sitting in our little study here in the house, and I'm hot now. So the jungle just seems outrageous. But back to the question you were asking, Fergus, was I guess the question was how did the reality in a physical sense how did it feel? Did you come up against those kind of moments? And
it matched up with what I thought it was going to be. The jungle is definitely, it's very hard to explain to people how hard the jungle is, the jungle phase of selection. Everyone sees the part in Brecon where you walk around, with the heavy packs. That is not selection. That is, it is difficult, but if you find that really hard, then you're probably not going to make it through the jungle, because the hills is just to get your plane ticket. It's just to get, they don't care who you are on the hills. That's just to thin out numbers. It is. And it's just like, it's to earn your plane ticket, the right to go to the jungle. And really that's where selection takes place. So this is interesting in terms of how things have changed from when I went on to now and how people approach it. So I have always, and it ties into, I guess, that competitive nature, or however you want to term it. I started training in a very structured way early on. So sort of 16 years old, started weights. 18, got into classic bodybuilding. I've lifted weights since then, and that was off the back of, I guess, a physical growing up on a farm as well. And then that kind of progressed when I joined the Marines in 2008. And then I was at 40 in 2009. I met a guy who introduced me to CrossFit. And at that point, CrossFit wasn't what it is now. It was very kind of niche, and it was much more around functional fitness. So I think the way that CrossFit's gone, a completely separate conversation, but it's now very games orientated. Back then, it was designed for military firefighters, and it was all about that more functional training. When I got down to Poole in the end of 2009 for the SFC course and selection, and then being based there was like me and probably 5 or 6 other guys wearing Vibram 5 fingers, because that's what you did CrossFit in back then, and doing like functional training. Everyone else, it was bodybuilding training, or guys who were into running or triathlon would do that. And I had a keen interest in training as well. I was always looking to what are the best methods? How can I get as fit and strong as possible? And so back then it was that GPP, general physical preparedness, around that CrossFit. And I took that and applied it to, it's like, right, okay, the hills is coming up, don't know what the jungle is, but how would an athlete approach this? And John, who I run T&E with, we went on selection at the same time. And that's how we approached it. It's like, right, what's the training we need to do? And you get guys who just like put weight on and go running. And we're like, that looks fucking stupid. You're just going to trash your joints. And so for us, we're like, right, okay, we need a base of strength and conditioning, because we know strong tendons, strong joints, like the muscular side, that is going to help us on the hills. So we kept up a strength and conditioning regime, added quite a bit of rowing in. And then anything with weight or kind of to the yomping side of things, I would do long, slow, weightless runs. I would do a medium weight, sort of 30 to 40 pounds, long days walking on the hills. And then I would do very heavy hill rep sessions where I'd put 60, 70 pounds on my back, stick a podcast on, find the steepest hill I could and just walk up and down. And I found that combination of it all kind of created a well-rounded aspect. And then down to nutrition. Again, on the hills, like, what does an athlete do? Well, you need to be drip feeding those carbohydrates, but also protein as well. So we've got 4-to-1, I think it was just high five or something, 4-to-1 carbs to protein. Had that in the camelback. And then had strategic, like nuts and sweets and stuff to keep piling on so it didn't go into that glycogen debt. And then I was, again, very specific, right, what calories do you need afterwards? Not many people were doing that then. Like now, you've got people like Mike Chadwick, Stoic Conditioning. Even the military itself, like they've got this whole kind of project down in Special Forces now where there's much more specificity around strength and conditioning, like all the stuff that we were doing back then, just because we were interested in it. So I don't think my preparation could have been any better, and I don't think I do things much differently now, but that was only because I had an external interest in it. Whereas you had a lot of guys who just turn up, and it's a bit of a myth about the military and even Special Forces at that time. Like, not everyone was into that kind of training. Guys, there's plenty of guys who didn't even really like the gym. They just do it now and again, but they're very strong mentally, and they kind of have done enough through the military that's enough to get them through, but they just use running or cycling or whatever it is. Everyone came at it from very different angles. I'm a massive believer that the strength and conditioning work I've done since a young age is the reason that helped me excel in the military, but also that I came away without really any bad injuries. Like, and kind of, I guess, a testament to it. In the Royal Marines, just before Final X, which is 10 days, you do run-throughs of the commando tests. And part of that, you have to run off this platform and jump onto a cargo net. But instead of jumping onto it and grabbing it with both hands, you turn sideways in the air, you punch one arm through, and then you lock that arm down. And it's meant to, I still think it's a fucking stupid technique, but apparently that's a much better way to do it. It was a wet day when we were doing the run-through. I hooked my arm through, my foot slipped off the cargo net, and we were wearing kit, and it ripped my whole body weight fell onto my arm hanging on the net, and it tore my, like, is it the bicep femoris, or basically where your pec attaches onto your arm and the bicep. I ripped it off, and I basically carried on, as in I carried on through training. So went to the med day, they had a look. I don't think they realised how bad it was. Luckily, my saving grace was it was Final X the next day. In the first 3 days of that, I basically just yomping, just walking with heavy weight. If I'd had to do anything on the range or things, I kind of would have been screwed because I couldn't even hold my weapon. But lads would help me put my Bergen on, and I'd just kind of walk with it. I just took a lot of painkillers. But I would say that without that kind of base of like the strength that I had built to that point, I think that it could have thrown someone else off, but enabled me still to kind of crack on, I guess, and carry on through. And there's been a few times where I've had like a bad parachute landing or stuff like that and recovered very quickly from it. And again, I attribute it just, and I'm sure there's other times where I've taken falls or stuff and again, not been injured. And whether this is completely subjective, I don't have any scientific evidence to back it up, but I feel like a consistent strength training regime has stood me in very good stead through like all the hard things that I've done.
Yeah, we would entirely agree, wouldn't we, Johnny?
Yeah, I think that there is a a great deal of data, and as you've described well, mate, there has been, you know, a history of guys like you were in the minority back then, having that kind of eye on strength and conditioning, especially nutrition, I think, as well. It's interesting to hear that you were quite so switched on to that too. But you'll have seen people, as you say, if they'd gotten through the whole selection process, mindset would have been what carried them for the most part. And then, you know, injuries may have happened for those people. They might have gotten lucky and it hadn't happened. But it's relatively straightforward data to now that we can look at to say that, you know, the likelihood is if you haven't built that robust frame and that kind of integrity, as you say, or as you've actually described, to carry yourself through injury and be able to kind of rely on overall strength to manage that, then you're going to come into some trouble. There's also something there, I think, speaks to your discipline and your mindset in a certain sense as well. So if you've covered off all those bases, and we describe that when we're taking people as aspirants through a kind of a strength and conditioning process, is that the S&C itself, if we can build that kind of that tendon robustness and all the things that go along with S&C, then what we're doing is removing that from the table and allowing the mindset to kind of sit at the front. And I guess that's something that you've proven to a certain degree there, is that, you know, you've covered all those bases and now you're able to concentrate fully on those kind of mental challenges that selection would have presented.
Yeah, that was the aim, actually. You've kind of summed up. You know, Jono approached it. The way that we viewed it was, because you don't, like, the jungle is, you don't really know, you've got no experience of that. I had done soldiering in the jungle when I was in 40 Commander, so I had done a month of jungle training, but, you know, you've got no idea what goes on with selection in there, so it's kind of the big unknown in the process. And so the way we viewed it was, we want to get through the hills and be as fresh as possible at the end, so that when we go into the jungle, we are not completely. We don't want to finish the hills and be absolutely dead on our feet, so that we're going in a kind of weaker state. You know, you still, even with all the training, the mindset element is massive. And back to your earlier question of whether I ever had that time of kind of wanting to quit, I never had that question of quitting in terms of physically hard. But what I did have are moments where I had to catch myself, and I can clearly remember. So when you do get to the jungle, the first sort of week, you basically just get thrashed around the area. You do lots of NavXs and things like that, and really they're just trying to thin people out again. And because you do spend a couple of weeks acclimatizing at a base camp outside, but once you're in the trees, you know, you're carrying anything from like 120, 140 pounds on your back. It's hot, it's humid, you can never get enough calories. Genuinely, you're going past people every day that are just on drips. They've just collapsed and passed out, and they're just on drips. If you can get past that first week physically you can make it to the end. Whether then you pass the soldiering skills elements of it is a different matter. But if you can get through that first week, then probably you can stay to the end. And I do remember, in that first week, it's like walking that line in your mind where you can feel yourself, you can feel that fatigue coming on like so strongly, and in that heat especially. And it's almost, if you follow that thread of oh fuck, I'm hot, like I'm so tired now, this is knackering, you can slide down, you can almost talk yourself into that collapsing state, as opposed to, and I remember doing it, it's like, fucking get a grip of yourself. And that is a mantra I use. That's something that I took from the Royal Marines. So something, and this kind of ties into the mindset. When you join the Royal Marines and going through training, like getting a grip of yourself is something you hear a lot. It's like, get a fucking grip of yourself, stand up straight, stop bending over. You're not allowed, and I talk about it in my videos, when you're doing PT in the gym, when you're out and about, no matter how knackered you are not allowed to bend over. You're not allowed to put your hands on your head. All you're allowed to do is lightly rest your hands on your chest. And what they're teaching you is for you to always take control of your body and mind, and not let your body control you, because your body does want to double over. You know, you see it in CrossFit, people lying on the floor, and what you're essentially saying is, well, that's me done. And what you should be saying is, you're never done, no matter how hard it is. You know, sometimes, I'm not saying, you know, sometimes you will collapse because you physically cannot stand up, but a lot of the time we have control over it. And it's something else, you know, funny you talk about embedding that ethos, I talk about reading books when I was younger, and this was before I joined the Marines, I think, and this kind of reaffirmed it. There's a series of books by Con Eagledon, and he does this historical fiction. So he's done one on Rome and Julius Caesar, but my favourite ones are the Genghis Khan. And I actually studied the Mongols at university, but so he does a historical fiction around the rise of Genghis Khan, and part of that Mongolian culture that he talks about in there, and whether it's made up or not, I don't know, but they're not the same thing. Never show the enemy that you are done. So no matter how hard the training they're doing, you never bend over double. You never have your hands on your knees. You always say to yourself, "I've got more. I can do more." And again, that really spoke to me because of that. I guess that competitive nature, and again with the Marines, that get a grip of yourself and never showing that you're knackered. And I took that forward with me, and so that's what I used when I could feel that kind of going in my mind. And I actually remember, so the DS that we had, this Irish guy on selection, and we were getting thrashed around those few days, and I'd always try and be at the front. And I remember him saying to it one point, he's like, "You're pretty fit, aren't you, Jeffries?" And in my head I was thinking, I am fucked. I'm on my limit here. But you never show it. You call it DS face. Like same in the Marines as well. You never show that fatigue. Like you could be dying inside, but they come along like, "How are you doing?" Like, "Good stuff." And that's all you say. Always, and that's what you project. And it's almost a fake it till you make it. That self-talk you're giving yourself and what you're projecting, you can draw strength from that, and it really does define whether you go down that, "Oh no, this is me, I'm done," or get a grip of yourself, "You've got this." And the more you tell yourself that and practice it, and I guess because I've been practicing it from in many ways a young age, from on that rugby field, like trying to be the best, winning the sprints, winning the suicide sprints, all of that stuff, trying to be the fittest, through to the Marines, having that ethos bedded in selection. By doing that for years and years, that then becomes your default. So your default becomes, "No, I've got this," as opposed to, "I don't get this," and kind of going the other way.
So we've spoken a lot about the actual prep that you've undergone and what is required for people to almost get through selection once they're there. But if we could distill it down to the golden question, which everybody everywhere really wants to ask when they have the opportunity to do so. So we will carry the beacon and ask the question of what are the characteristics that people need stepping onto day one of the selection process to be able to have what it takes to, on paper, important caveat, get through it. Because the variables that are thrown at you are exactly that. They are variables. You can't control those things. It's how you respond to them that is essentially what makes or breaks the process. But whether in a civilian background, in a military background, the characteristics that underpin a special forces operator make you a resilient, efficient human being. So the question that I'm always interested to decipher from these conversations, and I've had other people ask and heard other people ask, is what are the characteristics, the skills, and the exposure that people should have before they step foot into a special forces environment, or even consider it, whether that's military or otherwise, because I believe, and you might agree or disagree, that those characteristics are congruent with an efficient, high-performing individual, not just necessarily a tactical operator.
Yeah, so I won't dwell on the physicals, we've talked about that, but what you need for that, you obviously need a base physical requirement to be able to get through that course. So you need to be able to carry a certain load over certain distances, etc. So and converting that over to a high performance individual in life, almost what we were talking about, is the whole cowards of us all. So the more it's that general physical preparedness, the stronger and fitter you are, it's always going to help in life. You know, you are setting yourself off to have higher resistance to illness, like having more energy, offsetting injuries. Not, someone trips over the pavement now or bends over the wrong way and then pull their back. Like offset, especially as you get older, the more that you can work on the physical side, it's only going to help. And the mind and body are one system, and so you can't ignore one or the other. You need to train both. So those physical requirements, if you've met those, and the more work you can put into that, it's going to give you more space mentally to get through hard times, because the level at which that fatigue takes over and creates problems will be higher. You'll have basically more of a buffer for it. when it comes to the mental characteristics or characteristics/skills to work on, one, it does come back to the whole why. You need to have a very clear understanding of why you are taking on whatever the challenge is, whether it is in the military, whether it's starting a business, going for whatever it is. You need to have a very clear reason as to why you want to do that thing. And the more intrinsic that reason is, the more suffering you'll be able to take. The more externally based it is, so you're doing it because you think that's what you should be doing, or you like the thought of it or the image of it, then the harder it's going to be. And a good test as to a good way to kind of give you a practical way to test that is how much you love the process. So when I think back to selection, I love the process of training for selection as much, if not more in many ways, than even passing it. And it's almost, it's the quote I saw, again, it's a James Clear one, he speaks to an Olympic coach, and he says, what is the difference, outside of genetics and those other factors, the difference between athletes that make it and those that don't? And he says it's the ones that can handle the boredom, the ones that will day in, day out go and do the work when no one's watching, no one's there, it's just you going out on cold, wet, rainy days, or working on the evenings when everyone else is going out. Whatever it is, it's, are you willing, and can you even find satisfaction out of doing the boring work? And that's a good indicator as to whether you really want to do what it is, or whether you just want the reward at the end. So how much you're willing to dedicate to that is a good indicator. And then layered on top of that, it does, the more you want something, the more you need to obsess over it and therefore sacrifice. But again, it shouldn't feel like a sacrifice. So this is just speaking only from my own journey. Like, all my life was geared towards selection at that time. Those kind of 2 years that I was building up to it, that is all I thought about. That's all I cared about. And everything else was downgraded. I was best man at my best friend's wedding, and I missed the ceremony. I did make it to evening do, but I missed the ceremony because I was on a Hills training package. Didn't feel like a sacrifice. I was like, this is my choice, this is what's driving me, this is what I get satisfaction from. So that's another good indicator, is you need that obsession, and if you feel like that is a sacrifice, maybe it shouldn't be. Like, there should be a way to gain fulfillment and satisfaction through that. It's the whole, everyone talks about balance. No one wants balance, everyone wants satisfaction. And that looks differently for everyone. Like, at that time in my life, 90% of it was geared towards selection. So there was no balance per se, but I was very satisfied. Like, now it's different. I have a much more equal, I guess. Well, actually, I probably don't, because I love the business. I've got to drive around that. But in theory, that's what I'd have. So you need those things. I think another really core attribute that you need, a characteristic, is how you respond to adversity and failure, or things going wrong, because things are always going to go wrong through that process, and they want people who can respond, take that, basically accept it, learn from it, and quickly move forwards. There's a story actually I was only told the other day by a guy that I know, and when he went through selection, he said there was an officer going through who was really strong, like he was smashing it basically all the way through, on course for a very strong pass. And just before Final X in the jungle, the DS told him, basically pulled him aside and essentially said, because you don't get, just to put this into context, through the jungle process you don't really ever get any feedback, and that's something that throws off a lot of people, because they get in their own heads. Because you do mess up a lot of guys essentially feel like, well, I'm failing here, I've made all these mistakes, because the DS are always there, they're always just writing in their little notepads, and they'll take themselves off because they think they failed and they don't see the point in continuing, and then they'll find out actually they were doing well. And so it's another kind of tactic to see how you respond to that. So anyway, this officer being great, the DS pulled him aside and essentially said, "Oh, you're on a sticky wicket here, you better pull it out the bag for Final X, because we're watching you, and this is basically whether you're going to pass or not." And that just got in his head, and he ended up quitting. He actually quit, I think it was during or just before Final X, because it just completely screwed with his brain. And they did that on purpose. But what that showed is, well, actually, you don't want that person, because when you're in operations, and the same in life, things are always going to go wrong. And if you're the type of person who, when something goes wrong, that's all you can think about and dwell on, like, oh, I messed up here, or I did this, as opposed to, right, okay, that's happened, accept it, own it, and then move forward. How can I move forward and move on to the next thing? And it's a really important characteristic to have in those environments, but also in life, that the more that you can accept that failure is a part of the process, it's not separate, it's completely intrinsically linked to success, and that is just a learning opportunity and something that you can take as that, put it to one side and then move forwards. That's going to serve you far better than if you just dwell on that and you let that throw you off and you let that dictate your action. So that's actually being your response, which kind of comes down to whether you have a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. Your response to challenge and adversity and how you react when things go wrong, that's a really, really important characteristic that will define how you get through that course.
Which feeds very nicely into the questions that we were planning on asking you today before we categorically ran out of time to do so. So that is a lot of context for our listeners to dissect, a lot of context for us to dissect before we aim to get you back on very soon for part 2, which was meant to be today, but will no longer now be today, as it would be great to actually delve into how you apply the lessons that you've taken from your career in the military into a civilian environment now, because the majority of our listeners are civilians. We have a huge amount of non-civilian listeners, and we've taken many tactical athletes through different courses, different stages of their careers, which we are very fortunate to have done so. But there is so much similarity between a lot of the values that we hold close to our heart when it comes to exposing yourself to lots of different training environments and how that translates into one's mindset, that in their very essence are in line with a lot of things that you've said today. So I think we'd both love to unpack that next time. We'd love to unpack a little bit more that people can take away directly from your time in the Special Forces in terms of lessons. But that is a fantastic little bit of foundation for us to work from. So if you have enjoyed today's episode, everyone, do all the podcasty stuff, please go and check Simon Jeffries out on Instagram at The Natural Edge. Link is in the show notes down below. And is there a website as well, Simon, that I can link down below?
Yeah, Natural Edge web. So we've got, it's Simon Jeffries on LinkedIn, The Natural Edge on Instagram, The Natural Edge on YouTube, and the naturaledge.com website.
Fantastic. That will all be down below for anyone that wants to engage. And do keep an eye out for another episode landing very soon as the three of us can line up our rather constantly chaotic diaries to be able to make part 2 happen. So we will say thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Look forward to speaking again very soon. Thanks again, Simon.
Thank you very much. Pleasure being on.